Skinner's position is reductionistic, and contextual behavior science is kind of mixed up. It's not really one or the other. And so I prefer InterBehaviorism.
Proyecto dedicado a la divulgación, formación y terapia psicológica. Consulta nuestros servicios en nuestra web y redes sociales.
So first thing we would like to ask you is that how do you define InterBehaviorism and what are the key concepts to understand this philosophy?
InterBehaviorism is a philosophy of science, not just of psychology as a science, but of other sciences. It's a way of looking at nature. In psychological perspective, it's what has to be understood is what the focus of study is. It's a function of responding with respect to stimulating, occurring through a medium that is taking place in a setting. And it is all of that combined as an integrated field. It's a field construction, which means that everything is related to everything in that circumstance.
Okay. And which are the main points in common and discrepancies between InterBehaviorism and other behaviorisms like radical or contextual behaviorism?
Contextual behaviorism is derived from radical behaviorism. Okay, so I'll start with radical behaviorism. Skinner's radical behaviorism. It is Skinner's radical behaviorism is a kind of causal philosophy. In other words, various environmental circumstances are responsible for the occurrence of behavior. And once behavior occurs, other environmental circumstances are responsible in a causal way for the continuation of that behavior. So there's kind of a linear causal understanding of behavior. That circumstances, the units of radical behaviorism are operant classes that are defined by behaviors of various topographies that produce the same consequence. So operant behavior is what Skinner was interested in. But operant behavior, just described in terms of antecedent stimuli, responses, and consequences, ended up having to be, various other features of that situation had to be added. Motivating variables, deprivation, aversive stimulation, things of that sort. Also, the larger context in which behavior was occurring. So it's kind of a circumstance in which there is a causal relationship between stimuli and responses that is occurring under certain conditions of the organism and a setting. A context of some sort. What radical behaviorism didn't identify are certain aspects of that situation. Principally, it did not differentiate a stimulus as an object from a stimulus as a function. So the concept of stimulus function as separate from an object means that any given object may be home to multiple different functions. And all those functions are not just things out there in the world, they are relations with responding. So all kinds of complex human behavior, all kinds of animal behavior, but human behavior being even more complex by virtue of linguistic functions, in order to describe the complexities of human behavior, remembering, thinking, planning, dreaming, all of these kinds of things, you need the concept of stimulus function as distinct from stimulus object. And what radical behaviorism didn't have that construction. And it has made the understanding of complex human behavior from Skinner's perspective somewhat reliant on biology. Like we have these private events and all these complex things are inside the organism in some way, and that's how we account for thinking and remembering and all of that. Because there was no way to talk about it otherwise. But there's no psychological events inside the organism. There are aspects of the organism, and those are biological aspects. It's only in the interaction of the organism with the environment that you can talk about a psychological event. So radical behaviorism just really couldn't adequately deal with complexities without becoming reductionistic to biology. Contextual behavior science adopted the stimulus function as distinct from stimulus object, that construction. And that really came from Cantor's notions and earlier thinkers at the time that Cantor was writing those distinctions. And so contextual behavior science has this construction of a stimulus function, but it also is a causal system based on radical behaviorism. So Cantor's system has, of course, this distinction between stimuli and functions and stimulus objects. And it is a field construction, an integrated field construction. So there's no causality in it. Nothing makes anything else happen. And psychological events don't exist inside the organism. So they're all sort of related in that they all want to talk about the natural world. They're not sort of deliberately mentalistic or anything. But Skinner's position is reductionistic, and contextual behavior science is kind of mixed up. It's not really one or the other. And so I prefer InterBehaviorism.
Estás silenciado, Luis.
Okay, sorry. You have talked about the definition of behavior, not the unit of analysis of psychology, but what are the main implications for defining behavior as a relationship instead of taking the Skinnerian definition to understand behavior and this relationship with the experimental work?
Well, all experimentation is really kind of the same process, really. In other words, you have some sort of contained environment, and there are all kinds of things in that setting and in that circumstance as a field of interaction. And you change something, you add something to that environment, or you take something out of that environment and you see how it reconfigures as something else. Mm-hmm. I prefer to think of it as sort of reconfiguring, not that thing that you took out made the environment something that made behavior happen, or that thing you added made the behavior happen, but rather that it is an integrated field. And so if you take something out of it or put something into it, you change the field, you change the event. So from a standpoint of basic experimentation, it's sometimes useful to identify how you change the event. And it's not really too much of a problem to call that a cause. Mm-hmm. But it's that terminology is useful in that particular environment. Its causal thinking is not useful beyond a specific set of circumstances in which you're manipulating behavior. So I knew that the InterBehaviorism is kind of criticized because, oh, well, it didn't have any basic research and it didn't have any application. But InterBehaviorism is a philosophy. It's not a set of experimental procedures. It could certainly talk about experimentation. It doesn't need its own apparatus or something to be value to science. So it's kind of misunderstood as is criticized for things that it isn't. I mean, that they don't have anything to do with it.
Does this have an impact in the way we think we approach the experimental work? And I think about the time variable.
Yeah.
And this relationship in time, no, between stimulus and response, and that is that correct?
Well, ordinarily, from a behavioral standpoint, first the stimulus happens, and then the response happens, and then another stimulus happens. So there's a sort of temporal relations that we're talking about. But from an interbehavioral perspective, the stimulus doesn't happen first and then the response, because there is no stimulus without a response. There's no response that isn't related to a stimulus. So it doesn't, these stimulus response consequence, it's a kind of an abbreviated way of talking about it, because the stimulus of a light and the bar pressing and the food pellet, the light is not just a light, it's a seeing of the light, and the press is not just something the paw does, it does it with respect to an apparatus. And the food is not something that just shows up, it is the eating of the food. So each of those elements is an interaction. And as soon as seeing the light happens, by the time you press the bar, seeing of the light is now part of that context. Seeing of the light is part of pressing the bar. And as soon as you press the bar and receive the food, eating the food, seeing the light and pressing the bar are part of the situation of eating the food. So, the past keeps accumulating with the present. So there's kind of always a present circumstance. Mm-hmm. And the past is really, there's no memory stored inside of you. So where is the past? Well, it's in the field. It's in the setting. It's how you remember something is that the setting is configured in such a way that you're interacting with functions of stimuli that you interacted with before at an earlier present time, sort of. So there's a different conceptualization of time, actually.
Right. There is a strong community of interbehaviorists in Mexico, for example. We know other interbehaviorists from other countries, some of them in Spain. But what's the reach of interbehaviorism nowadays at the universities and academics? What's the status of interbehaviorism nowadays?
I know of the interbehaviorists in Mexico. They're working with Amelia Rivas and others there. And I know the interest in Spain. And I know there's interest in Peru. And there's not an awful lot of interest in the United States. Cantor was a professor, at a university, and he had some students. But those students, for the most part, didn't go out to other universities and develop students and etc. So I think it just hasn't been taught very much. But my students are out there now, and they've had good interbehavioral training, read a lot of Cantor's books, and I'm just hoping that they'll continue to teach interbehaviorism to their students. But you know, sort of causal thinking is really so dominant that when you talk about a integrated field that isn't a kind of a cause of something, that everybody gets kind of worried about that. So, yeah.
Do you think that the conception of interbehaviorism is going to change in the future? The conception that have the students, the psychologists?
Yeah, it might. Because interbehaviorism as a philosophy is not restricted to psychological events, but can be applied to biological events, chemical events, sociological events, cultural events, that kind of thing. I think that this sort of field notion, this integrated field notion, may show up in other domains more, like in biology. In biology, you know, they used to study the cardiac system, but then it turned out that that was related to something else, which was related to something else, related to something else. So you couldn't really study one system. It didn't make sense. And so there's a kind of integrated field notion there. And the same thing about sort of cultural circumstances, too. So I think interbehaviorism is, as a philosophy, is likely to be present in a lot of different other disciplines, a lot of other sciences. But in those other sciences, there's likely to be some drift because the scientists themselves are individuals. They're individual people with individual histories, brought up as causal thinkers, and that, you know, unless you have an interbehavioral psychologist, a naturalistic psychologist who can talk about things like thinking and remembering and dreaming, things of those sorts, who can understand observation, understand construct development, understand theory, then you're likely to get some drift in the potential that interbehavioral thinking would have in other disciplines. Cantor always said that you know, you need a valid philosophy and a valid psychology in order to understand the world. So I think there's likely to be some drift there. But I think whatever does happen will be valuable.
Gracias por ver este vídeo, os dejamos por aquí un enlace a nuestra última formación y por aquí algunos vídeos que os pueden resultar de interés. Si estáis buscando ayuda psicológica, también podéis mirar en la descripción del vídeo, donde encontraréis nuestra web y podréis solicitar asistencia terapéutica de un profesional confiable y que os ofrecerá ayuda psicológica basada en evidencia científica.